Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the proposed Constitution of the White Earth Nation, and we're continuing on to theme 6 in the workbook, which deals with the judiciary, which is chapters 14 through 16. So if you have your workbook, you can go ahead and turn to page 26, where we start to see chapter 14, which lays out the judiciary. Article 1 of chapter 14 tells us that the judiciary will consist of the White Earth Court, a Court of Appeals, and other courts that would be established by the Legislative Council. The White Earth Court is essentially, under this Constitution, the trial court. And we see in Article 2 the power of judicial review for the White Earth Court over a wide range of matters here. Legal matters, disputes, civil procedures, criminal laws, ordinances, regulations, codes, family relations, domestic violence, juvenile justice, conservation, governance, etc. So we see a wide range here, and including the final one listed, constitutional issues of the White Earth Nation. And we've mentioned on a couple of occasions in some of the other sections that if a provision of this Constitution is violated, a citizen can have recourse within the courts. Article 2 of chapter 14 here tells us that that recourse would first go to the White Earth Court, to the trial court for review. Article 3 is the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals will have original and appellate jurisdiction. So the Court of Appeals will hear appeals from decisions from the White Earth courts, and they will have what we call original jurisdiction in cases where the Legislative Council is initiating action. So if the Legislative Council is going to take legal action, the Legislative Council can go directly to the Court of Appeals and sort of bypass the White Earth courts. But in all other cases, items, cases, disputes come to the White Earth Court first. And so this lays out that process here. This also notes in Article 3 that the Court of Appeals decisions are conclusive. Right. So that's where you have a chance to get a second ruling, and if you have your second ruling, it's conclusive. Chapter 15 deals with the powers of the White Earth courts, laying out very clearly Article 1 that the courts have the authority to interpret and construe the laws, ordinances, regulations that is passed by the Legislative Council and this Constitution. So we've talked about the different branches of government and their different roles between the Legislative Council making law, the President executing and implementing law, and here we see the judiciary, the judicial system, interpreting that law and interpreting the Constitution. What does the idea of freedom of speech or freedom of electronic communication, what does that actually mean? Right. The judiciary would have the power to interpret that broad language into a more specific decision.
Which is a huge issue here, right? I mean, the dynamic of what makes a constitution a viable governing document is this process, right? Whenever the court is independent and has clear authority to interpret the Constitution and be a part of that process. So you have the Legislative Council making its own determination of how to legislate and develop certain parts of the Constitution. You have the office of the President implementing and executing those laws. You have citizens being impacted by it. If they don't like what's going on, they have the right under this Constitution to sue the government, whether it's the Legislative Council or the President, and the courts have the authority to take up that suit and determine whether that action of the government is in violation of the Constitution or not.
Yeah, so we see that that is the primary role of the court. It's a very important role in the whole structure of the government that's proposed under this Constitution. We'll continue here to Article 2, which says the courts will issue legal decisions, a variety of manners here, injunctions, etc. So they have all those tools at their disposal. We move to page 27 to Article 3. The courts will establish procedures, rules, forms, etc. So the courts will have to establish as we've talked about a number of times, this sets out a framework, and there'll have to be other policies and procedures established. The same is here.
Right.
That's similar to Article 5 here. The court shall establish and publish a judicial code of ethics as well. Article 4 is an interesting article that's come up. It says that the court shall ensure and practice restorative justice in a variety of situations: civil, minor criminal, juvenile and family matters. Basically, whenever possible, the courts should turn to the practice of restorative justice. And so this is a practice that has the principle behind it of the idea of the offender admitting responsibility for their action, taking responsibility for that, and maybe having restitution in a way that isn't sitting a certain number of days in jail, but is instead maybe making amends by a formal apology. It might be public service. It might be service to a certain family if they committed a crime against. And so the idea is to work for towards the idea more of healing and community restoration than opposed to a judicial system that is punishment focused.
And it provides not just an opportunity but an obligation to think through how those ideas of restoring justice, restorative justice, would work here. What are the traditional Anishinaabe practices and values and ideas that are applicable here? What is the history and story of the community and practices that come out of the community in that sense? And it doesn't just allow for it to happen. It sets a requirement, a stage for it to happen.
Yeah, so it sets out the basic fundamental idea that whenever possible, restorative justice will be practiced. It's not going to be possible in every situation, but the idea sets out that that is what, during the convention process, what delegates really wanted. They really wanted to see a system of justice that had that idea of restoring, of working together towards healing, hopefully towards measures that people agree upon are appropriate, rather than having a judge set down a sentence. Instead, work towards a more communal process.
Right.
So that's laid out there. Then we have Chapter 16, which deals with the White Earth judges. Article 1 tells us that the White Earth Court, that trial court, will consist of a chief judge and associate judges. The chief judge will be elected in a majority +1 in a duly called election. Here's our one exception to the term limits. In this case, the chief judge is elected for life appointment. The chief judge is elected, and we'll talk about in a minute, can be impeached or removed, but doesn't have a term, doesn't have a term limit.
Yeah.
And so that's an effort towards trying to make the chief judge impartial so that the judge isn't making rulings to try to sway votes or to court a certain segment of the population to get reelected. But it also gives the chief judge a high degree of power not to have to be reelected, but to only have to be elected that one time. So it's balancing those things.
And as an elected official, under Chapter 6, Article 9, the chief judge is required to be a member or a citizen of the White Earth and reside within the boundaries of the White Earth Reservation in order to run for that office.
Yep. Good. So that White Earth Court will have the chief judge and then associate judges. Article 2 tells us that the chief judge will appoint the necessary number of associate judges for 5-year terms with the consent of the Legislative Council. So here we don't have a set number. The number of associate judges will vary over time depending on how many cases the court is hearing and how many judges are necessary. What we have here is a limit, a 5-year term for the associate judge. They aren't, because they're not elected, they could serve numerous 5-year terms. They don't have that kind of term limit in that sense. and the chief judge gets the consent of the legislative council.
So its own check and balance.
Check and balance here in that regard. The Court of Appeals will have 3 judges. Those will be appointed by the legislative council in consultation with the chief judge. So here, a similar sort of mirror process between the associate judges and the judges on the Court of Appeals. The chief judge will not be a member of the Court of Appeals. That's just point of clarification. We already said he's a member of the White Earth Court. Court of Appeals judges also serve 5-year terms. They can otherwise practice law or be associated with a law firm. That's primarily because they most likely won't be employed full-time as appeals judges. They will maybe work for a law firm, serve as judges for other nations, etc. So it allows them that flexibility. Articles 6 through 10 gives us the qualifications of the judges. Judges of the courts have to be at least 25 years of age, proven moral character, and have not been convicted of a felony. Judges have to be graduates of a law school accredited by the American Bar Association. They have to be admitted to the bar to practice law in either native community, state, or federal courts. They have to be experienced lawyers, magistrates, or judges. And Article 10, they have to have knowledge of Anishinaabe culture, traditions, and general history. So it's only the chief judge that has to be a white Earth citizen because of that elected position. The other judges don't have to be white Earth citizens. They can be. They do have to, though, have at least a general knowledge of Anishinaabe culture and traditions, and that harkens back to our discussion on restorative justice and looking at traditional practices as well, that judges need to have some knowledge of that in order to operate in this court system. And so all of those judges have 5-year terms. Article 11 deals with judges recusing themselves or taking themselves off of a case if there is certain qualifications. So judges have to recuse themselves if there are any possible conflict of interest, the appearance of personal interest, and the potential challenge of impartiality. So here, a pretty high standard, not just a conflict of interest, but a possible conflict of interest. So an attempt to make the court as independent as possible to try to remove any questions about partiality. In some of our discussions of these issues, we've heard concerns raised about the small nature, in some ways, of the community. And people know each other, people know each other's families, and what if a judge knows your family? Well, that would definitely be a potential conflict of interest. And so that provides some assurances to people who are going to be taking cases through the judicial system that they will be able to have an impartial judge looking at their case, not somebody who knows them personally or has that kind of a history. And then Article 12 deals with impeachment. Judges shall be impeached by the Legislative Council and removed from judicial practice for abuses of impartiality, bribery, political impropriety, or felony conviction. So we have some specific reasons laid out there why a judge could be impeached. A judge cannot be impeached if if a judge says a law that the Legislative Council made is unconstitutional. That isn't grounds for the Legislative Council to remove a judge.
And so you see some continuity between Article 11 and Article 12. And, part of the consideration is, the promise of an independent and separate judiciary. And, part of your consideration is whether this accomplishes that. It establishes a chief judge with essentially a lifetime appointment that can be impeached, but for fairly specific reasons, right? And associate judges at the trial court level and the appellate level, in which there's checks and balances, where the chief judge appoints the trial court judge or the White Earth Court judges, and the Legislative Council approves. And the appellate court is appointed by the Legislative Council in consultation with the chief judge. So there's checks and balance there. Part of the consideration is the way an appellate court deals with the lower courts, and whether that really promotes an independent and separate judiciary is part of your consideration and part of what you need to think about in establishing this. Clearly, the whole Constitution looks at establishing very distinct branches of government, each branch of government having a distinct authority, separation of powers with an independent judiciary. Part of the conversation that we see in the community quite a bit is it's still folks from White Earth that are going to fill those positions, right? And any system that you set up is going to be implemented by the people. It's going to have the integrity that the people bring to it. And there's naturally going to be a learning process because this is a very new form of government that's established. And that learning process is a part of what it means to not only build the infrastructure for this with a new legislative council, a president, and a court system, but use it on a day-to-day basis, right? What does it mean to legislate and not manage the government in an executive fashion? What does it mean to be the chief judge on the judiciary and grow the program, right? Because that position is quite important. And it's a lifetime post, ostensibly.
Yep.
And so that's a part of the conversation of all of this. Do you think this is a viable constitution? Do you think this is a frame of government and a form of government that can work for you? Any other comments?
And that's, we have covered now the Constitution in its entirety, and as Terry said earlier, in many ways this is an introduction that we've gone through here today. Take a look, dig into it, read it for yourself. That everyone who reads it is going to have a variety of reactions. There's going to be things that you like and things you don't like. And we've already mentioned, ultimately, this vote on November 19th is yes or no. And so you have to come to a balance for yourself through this. Getting this document written, going through the process of constitutional delegates, there were many compromises that were made. I think I can pretty safely say that no one delegate or no one person likes exactly everything. It's a process of compromise. And so ultimately, when you're coming down to it for yourself, you have to look at the weight of the Constitution as a whole. Overall, is it going to work? Is it a good structure? Overall, is it not going to work? Do you think it's not an effective structure? And so there's going to be pros and cons as you go through each of the different chapters for yourself. And so this is hopefully designed to help you think through some of that, to raise some of the main important points of the Constitution and help you think about what your decision might be.
So the process that's going to move forward from here is going to be fairly straightforward. We have November 19 as the referendum date. We this week are mailing out a copy of the proposed Constitution, and then immediately after that we'll mail out a copy of the current MCT Constitution. And we'll send out notices to everybody about the November 19 referendum date, and be in contact with you on several other times. We'll mail out the ballots for the referendum vote itself. We'll do several other contacts and information sharing pieces with you so that there's a regular stream of information that gets out there about the voting process, as well as other opportunities to review the materials. At any time you can contact me here at White Earth. My contact information is in this workbook on page 1. You can contact me at the office here. The main office is area code 218-983-3285. I'm at extension 5921. You can also reach my cell phone, 218-850-1334. And you can always send me an email, terry.janice, terry.janis@whiteearth.com. And with that...
we would also encourage you to check the website regularly, whiteearth.com. There is a section on constitutional reform where probably you're finding this video and
Hopefully.
the workbook itself and other documents and updates that can help you as well. So we encourage you to check that for information as well.
And with that, I thank you for looking at this. Share this with your friends. If this was helpful to you, share it with your friends. Let them know. Host a little Constitution party at your house and invite your friends over and look at these materials like this. If there's anything more that we can do to get information to you and help make this process a more informed one, please contact me at the information that I gave you.
Make
Okay.
which.
Thank you.